The Northeast Corridor. It is without question the busiest intercity rail line on all of the North American continent, and nothing even comes close to it. Covering 457 miles from Washington to Boston through Baltimore, Wilmington, Philadelphia, Newark, New Haven, and Providence, the corridor is always a hive of activity, from the workhorse commuter trains of various operators along the route to the intercity Amtrak trains, from the trusty Northeast Regional to the speedy Acela trains, and even long-distance trains on the first or last leg of their usually over 1,000-mile journeys. In the year 2024, amid growing ridership for passenger trains in general in the US, more people are riding the Northeast Corridor than have done in years, even going back to pre-2020 levels and even giving ridership from the golden age of rail a run for its money. While that isn't the case for every operator, one that is seeing a lot of traffic back on its trains is New Jersey Transit, the state operator of regional rail services across its namesake state, with its principal operations being commuter trains to and from New York City. But throughout the summer of this year, this portion of the line in particular has been subject to horrendous delays and reliability issues, all related to the brutal heat wave that the region has been experiencing in this time, along with long-standing issues present with the line. So, what's going on here? Why is the heat affecting hundreds of thousands of people like this? What can be done to fix it? And what is being done to fix it? Well, be sure to stay hydrated, folks, because this hot topic took me for quite a journey. So, before we go much further, we have to understand a few things about the Northeast Corridor generally. Built out in loosely connected phases and stages from its first section between Newark and Trenton, New Jersey opening in 1834 to the final part of the modern right-of-way being built between Manhattan and the Bronx being completed in 1917, the Northeast Corridor, as we know it today, would become part of the consolidated main lines of two giant railroad companies by the time of the golden age of rail in the early 1900s. The northern part of the line, from New York City to Boston, would be owned by the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad, or the New Haven for short, and would pass through the likes of Bridgeport, Stamford, New Haven, New London, and Providence on its way to Boston. The southern part, though, between New York City, Newark, Trenton, Philadelphia, Wilmington, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C., would be owned by the company generally considered to be the largest and most powerful railroad company of the Rail Golden Age, the Pennsylvania Railroad. Their combined route provided the most direct and fastest alignment connecting the major cities of the Northeast megalopolis, but even then, there was much more to come by the time the final parts of the line were starting to take shape. Due largely to a mandate by the city of New York which banned steam locomotives and later diesel locomotives from running in the tunnels of New York, for very, very, very good reasons, I must stress that, along with increasing traffic demand, the Pennsy, following an emerging trend started by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in the 1890s, would electrify the section of the Northeast Corridor between the newly completed New York Penn Station and Manhattan Transfer Station near Newark in 1910, though this would use the more well-known at the time DC Third Rail System, as opposed to the system that we see today, which I'll get to later. However, while the Long Island Railroad, which was owned by the Pennsy at the time, would begin electrifying their commuter network using this system with 750-volt DC third rail power, the long distances of the main lines proved to be less than optimal for a third rail system due to the high number of substations needed to deliver the current because of low voltages that third rail could provide. However, the Pennsy didn't give up on this idea, as in 1915 they would electrify the first section of their original main line between Philadelphia's Broad Street station and the suburb of Paoli, Pennsylvania, this time with 11,000-volt AC overhead catenary wires. This would allow for much higher voltages and therefore superior performance at a cheaper cost compared to third rail, as fewer substations would need to be built and maintained for the same distances. And this was already improvement compared to the vast improvement that electric power in general, third rail or catenary provided over steam locomotives and even later diesels, something that still holds true to this day, to the point that the most powerful locomotives ever built are all electrics. Naturally though, due to the upfront costs of setting up the system, the electric wires would spread across the Penske's network slowly, starting with their commuter lines around Philadelphia and spreading out onto their branch lines and main lines until by 1934, the electric wires were set up for the entire length of their section of the Northeast Corridor between New York City and Washington, D.C., replacing both the third rail system between Penn Station and Newark, but it would also replace steam locomotives elsewhere along the system, being replaced by the legendary GG1 electric locomotives on intercity passenger and mainline freight workings, and the venerable MP54 electric rail cars on commuter services across the corridor. The Penske would also extend the electric wires on the main line between Paoli and Harrisburg by 1938, and they even had plans to keep the wires going to Pittsburgh and eventually to Chicago, thus allowing the famous Broadway Limited to be run with electric power for the whole length of its journey. But then World War II happened, and it very quickly put the kibosh on those ideas. The New Haven would even get on the electric game too, building out an electric network using overhead catenary even before the Penske did, starting in 1907, with the wires reaching New Haven by 1914, where it would stay for decades. They wanted to extend the wires all the way to Boston after its initial success, but the New Haven's infamous and pretty much eternal financial problems prevented them from doing so. And it wouldn't be until the 1990s when the job was finally done by Amtrak, who put up the wires from New Haven to Boston before the debut of the Acela Express in 2000. On the whole, the use of electric traction has truly stood the test of time, and it's enabled the NEC to be a line capable of operating the fastest trains on the continent and generally enables performance, frequency, and reliability that other rail operations can only dream of in North America. And the over 800,000 daily riders of the NEC across its length and numerous operators and services reap the benefit of it on a daily basis. However, these past few months have brought to the fore one of the key problems that the NEC has faced, which, if it can be summarized in a phrase, it would be as follows. The NEC's infrastructure is insanely old. Now, to a lot of people who are familiar with the corridor, this is definitely not a surprise to anybody. However, when people talk about the age of the infrastructure, it's most easily described by the ages of structures, like bridges and tunnels, and thankfully there are several projects underway that seek to rectify the obvious cases where old infrastructure needs to be replaced. However, there are a lot of lesser discussed areas where updates are actively considered or on the back burner, such as track geometry improvements and even smaller stuff such as increasing the amount of fencing along the tracks to prevent a frankly disturbing number of trespassers strikes on the route. However, the recent heat waves have displayed another area where old infrastructure is coming back to bite, and it can be found by looking at the catenary systems that power the trains, particularly so on the former Pennsylvania half of the line, and most infamously so in New Jersey. Throughout the summer of 2024, numerous days of lengthy delays and cancellations rocked the NEC network, leaving many riders, particularly New Jersey Transit riders, struggling to get to and from home each day, even leading to a bit of a subtle blame game on social media. Not long after the worst days of the crisis, New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy had a sit-down with the heads of both NJT and Amtrak to work out what was going on and what can be done to fix it. While it's understandable to fear that a solution to this may seem complicated, it actually isn't, at least in principle. In fact, the overarching answer is already being undertaken in current update projects on the docket. But first, I think it's good to understand what the problem is and where it stems from. And that has to do, in part, with the most visually imposing symbol of the Northeast Corridor that's not the trains themselves. And that is the towering catenary poles that hold up the wires. Standing at up to 80 feet tall in places, the catenary poles of the route have come to symbolize the grand ambition and long-lasting legacy that electric power has had on this route. With the contact wires held at a lower height just above the tracks, but still at a height that double-decker passenger cars can fit underneath them easily, the other wires hanging overhead carry the current to power the signaling system, and at its higher levels are the ground wires and the wires carrying the 132,000 volts of high current electricity to the substations, which are set up every 15 to 20 miles along the route to convert the 132,000 volt current to the usable 12,000 volt current that the trains pick up, all of which, quite amazingly, comes from one single generating station. Here.
Behind me is the Safe Harbor Dam on the Susquehanna River, just downstream from Columbia, Pennsylvania. Opened in 1931, just as the Pennsy was electrifying the corridor, not only does this power station provide power for people from Philadelphia to Baltimore and everywhere in between, but there's 2 turbines in this power station that provide power for the entirety of the Northeast corridor from Washington, D.C. to New York City. And that leads me to a rather interesting thing about the infrastructure of the corridor itself. It is old, and the catenary poles are old, but it really shouldn't be as big a problem as it is, and the dam's a pretty good example of that. The dam is still a very good power station for the route, but here's the thing. The dam has seen updates over the years to match increases in power demand. The catenary poles on the NEC haven't, at least not for the most part, and that's a point that's going to be pretty obvious as we head south to meet the corridor itself. I'm here in Perryville, Maryland, where the power lines from the dam meet up with the power lines for the rail line itself. And it's here where we really get down to the main issue with the NEC's infrastructure at the moment. It's not the power source, it's not the high voltage lines, it's not even really the substations, at least it's not in principle. And contrary to what our good friend Mr. Wendover suggested, it's not the 25 hertz frequency of the current, though upgrading the current generally and have it run at 25,000 volts as opposed to the standard of 12,000 volts now, it would be nice, but not exactly necessary. No, the big problem is the actual wires itself and how they are physically hung above the tracks.
The kind of catenary wires that are hung above the tracks of the Northeast Corridor are of the old style from the 1930s. That's not an exaggeration. Today, they are technically known as variable tension catenary. And right there in the name, you could probably start to guess the problem, but not in a way that you might first expect. Despite looking like that they'd be easy to sway around as they hang above the tracks as they're held by other wires, they're actually held quite rigidly, since the whole point is to keep the wires taut in place so that they stay consistent and allow their current going to the trains to flow reliably to the pantographs, which are the big electric pickups on the top of the train that's used to collect the power. Simple idea in principle, yes, and it worked when it was new. However, there is a big problem. The wires sag, hence why it's called variable tension catenary, since the rigidity, well, varies, not under the poles, but between the poles. One thing that I'm sure you notice about the wires is that, like all electric wires, they're made of metal, copper to be specific. And as with all things made of metal, they are subject to thermal expansion and contraction. The hotter the temperature gets, the more the metal expands. And while they may not be immediately noticeable to most people most of the time, it does have a notable effect on operations. It can even affect the rails themselves, and in extreme examples, it can cause them to warp so much that they bend the alignment, making the tracks anywhere from dangerous to useless. Thankfully, there are numerous ways to counter this, such as joint gaps between the rails, and for continuously welded rail like you see on the corridor, there are stressing techniques used in the laying process that assure that the rails are made to handle the conditions that they face. The opposite also holds true in winter, when the metal contracts in cold temperatures. If you've ever seen pictures from places like Chicago of trains running over tracks, particularly switches that were set on fire, those fires were deliberately lit by maintenance crews to reduce the contraction in the rails and prevent the rails from snapping apart. Catenary wire works on the same principle, though its solutions require something a bit different. What happens here is that the heat causes the wires to sag over the rails between the poles, so that the wires become less tense. Since while the wires don't move as much above the mountings, the expansions between the mountings does cause them to drop out of their optimal position, and this can cause problems that have hindered the performance of trains on this part of the route going back over decades. Literally. In the time since the Pennsy installed the wires in the 30s, the speed that trains run at, as well as the trains themselves, have changed dramatically. Higher speeds and higher frequencies were demanded, going above the 100 mph top speed of the GG1s. By the time the Metroliner project was being pursued in the 60s, the by then 30-year-old infrastructure of the route was proving to be a hindrance to their potential top speed in service. While the Metroliner trains, boxy appearance and all, could reach 160 miles an hour and more under testing, the catenary was one of the main reasons as to why they would never be allowed to run at that speed in regular service, with the trains limited to 120 miles an hour at best. Even to this day, a lot of sections of the line have this same general configuration, with a hard cap on the speed of stretches where they are used at 135 miles an hour, even if the track layout and track geometry can handle speeds much faster than that. Not only can this be observed on board the train in terms of travel times, but the nature of the wires can actually be heard. Have a listen here as this Acela roars by Newark, Delaware at 135 miles an hour. Listen for the creaking sound. If that doesn't symbolize the wire's issues, I don't know what does. The end result has been most evident recently, as the variable tension of the wires has led to the wires sagging, causing anything from electrical arcing issues to getting caught in the pantographs of trains, most often New Jersey Transit trains, and thus either knocking down the wires or knocking the pantographs off of the NJT trains. But more generally speaking, this forces the trains to run at slower speeds than their normal services, something that Amtrak has even had to mention on their website a few times recently. But wait a minute, why are the NJT trains getting their pantographs knocked off by the drooping wires, while Amtrak doesn't really have this issue to a large extent? Wouldn't the Amtrak trains also be suffering a similar issue? The answer to that is, well, yes, but actually no, at least not to the same extent. While the point of NJT trains being generally more frequent than Amtrak trains is one factor, this largely has to do with the kinds of trains that different operators run. Amtrak mostly runs trains that are a traditional locomotive haul formation, with a locomotive at the front of the train with a single pantograph going up to the wire as it pulls the train along, or pushes it sometimes. A lot of NJT trains also run under the same idea, and therefore they also use one pantograph to make contact with the wires. Some Amtrak trains, most famously the Acelas, but also some Northeast regionals, have two pantographs contacting the wire, one on each locomotive, or power car in the case of the Acelas, and they have one of them at each end. The resonant waves from the first pantograph running along the wire can cause the second one to bounce off the wires. But since there are only two pantographs for every 8 to 12 cars on the train, this is less of an issue, as the wires do have time to straighten out before the second pantograph runs along them. However, there is a certain kind of NJT train that has been uniquely susceptible to this problem, and sadly, it's a train that has long been beloved among NJT riders and rail fans alike. These are the Aero 3 electric rail cars, one of the longest serving commuter train types in the country. Built by General Electric and Avco from 1977 to 78 and being a cousin of the equally long-lasting Silverliner 4 cars used by SEPTA in the Philadelphia area, these cars have been an old reliable type of car for the last 45 years now, with their top speed of 100 miles an hour, quick acceleration, and relative ease of maintenance, still seeing them work across the electric territory of the NJT system, from the demanding commuter trains of the Northeast Corridor down to this awesome little service, the famous Princeton Dinky Shuttle from Princeton University to Princeton Junction. While the Arrows are generally considered to be second-line units behind the locomotive haul trains today, these cars are still rather commonly used. And it's these cars in particular that have been involved with a lot of the wire issues on the NEC and the connected North Jersey coastline. So much so that cases where the Arrows have had their pantographs ripped off is becoming a more common occurrence than I would like to see. So why is this? Well, remember how I said the locomotive haul trains have at worst a pantograph every 8 to 12 cars? Well, these have a pantograph every 1 or 2 cars, and in a formation like this 10-car train shown here, that's at best 5 pantographs per train, all spaced very close to one another. It simply becomes the laws of resonant waves and the law of averages when the pantographs bounce off the wires with these things. Thankfully, though likely much to the chagrin of enthusiasts, it seems like this issue is going to be resolved through a replacement. In late 2018, NJT made a deal with Bombardier, later acquired by Alstom, for a new fleet of double-decker multiple unit sets to replace the Arrows. These will be 3-car sets with a single pantograph powering 3 coaches, as opposed to 1 or 2. And combined with other fixes in the works and those needing to be pursued, this is one step of the puzzle not only to improve speed and capacity on NJT services, but better reliability as well. And it's possible that this will be one of the first fixes to arrive on the scene, since the first set was revealed to be testing at Alstom's factory after being stuck in limbo for a time following the pandemic. It will be sad to see the old units go, but 45 years is quite a solid lifespan for any train. Plus, I get the sense that the Arrow 3s might stick around to serve on the Princeton Dinky, so that should be nice to see for a long time to come. But this still doesn't resolve all the problems that the wires face, not even close. It still doesn't fix the fact that the wires still sag. So what can we do about that? Well, how about something that's already been done elsewhere on the corridor? On the fastest parts of the corridor, in fact. Instead of the outdated variable tension system, newer catenary systems and rebuilds of old ones have been seeing the introduction of constant tension catenary, which is the ultimate endgame solution to fixing the reliability problems of the NEC and increasing speeds on the corridor at the same time. So this has gotta be some pretty high-tech stuff, right? How does it work? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Contrary to what has been suggested incorrectly via oversimplification by our good friend Mr. Wendover in a video on this matter, it does not involve tearing down the whole system and rebuilding it from scratch. Instead, it's an active rebuild of the old system. But the important thing is to do this. The wires are kept constantly taut between the poles by attaching pulleys on the ends of wire sections where there are large counterweights hanging from the poles, so that when the wires expand and contract, the counterweights go up and down to keep the wires taut, even with trains running at higher speeds with multiple pantographs. This is how pretty much every modern electrification project since the 60s has been set up, and it's proven itself to almost completely get rid of this problem, making electrification even more reliable than alternatives, even in harsh environments, including right here in the United States. It's been used in places from Caltrain's recent electrification scheme in the Bay Area to the RTD commuter rail system in Denver, and even on the Northeast Corridor itself. Remember that electrification that Amtrak did in the 90s from New Haven to Boston to prepare for the Acela? That's all constant tension systems. And as a result, they don't have these wire problems. Ever. And for the longest time, that section was the only place where you would see the Acelas do 150 miles an hour. In 2020 though, a new section of the corridor had been upgraded with constant tension, and that's right here along one of the most famous sections of the corridor, known as the Jersey Racetrack. From Hamilton to just before New Brunswick, the almost straight shot of the line has been upgraded to constant tension wires, which makes this another place to watch or ride the Acellas doing 150 and soon 160 miles an hour with the new trains on the way. They wanted to go even further with it too, and they wanted the wires to go beyond the 14 miles put up to 23 miles, and extend the wires from New Brunswick to just before Hamilton to Trenton. But horrendous management, largely derived from improper hiring and conflicts of interest by an Amtrak executive at the time, prevented this from happening, and it was shortened to the 14-mile section that we see today.
And that's really been one of the biggest millstones around the neck of making the NEC faster and more reliable for the longest time. It's been inconsistency with the level of spending for capital projects to bring the line up to a state of good repair, but also to future-proof it for increasing speeds and for future ridership demand. And it's not at all helped by really a lack of a cohesive vision for what the NEC wants to be. And while a lot of funding was given to Amtrak and to the NEC in general via the 2021 infrastructure law, a lot of that money is, perhaps understandably, going towards bigger projects that require replacing pieces of infrastructure that date back to long before the electrification plan was even considered in the first place. Now, don't get me wrong here. All of these are good projects, even if a few of them, like the Frederick Douglass Tunnel, for instance, is way more expensive than it has any business being, something I'll yell about another time perhaps. But it's pretty evident that even with things like bottleneck fixes and track geometry improvements put off to a later date, fixing the electrification scheme is one of the easiest ways to improve not only speed, but also reliability, safety, and maintenance costs of the Northeast Corridor in general. It may not sound like one of those big sexy things out there, but it can produce some sexy results in the long term. So what can those results be?
According to calculations made by transit policy researcher and mathematician Alon Levy, it's been estimated that upgrading the line to constant tension catenary will cut trip times between New York and Washington by 10 to 11 minutes, which, combined with the current projects underway, the Frederick Douglass Tunnel, the Susquehanna River Bridge, and the Gateway project, could well see an overall reduction in travel times by upwards of half an hour, meaning that it's possible to see an Acela service run between the two cities in under 2.5 hours, as opposed to the 2 3/4 hours we see currently. And that's with schedule padding, I might add, which the NEC is notorious for in order to compensate for delays, which are for numerous reasons that I'll talk about more of in the future. But more than anything else, as it can probably be gleaned, these will make the systems much more consistent and reliable, since trains will not need to be slowed to compensate for sagging wires or for outright wire outages, meaning that not only will there be less headaches for passengers, but the service can be made even faster by removing some padding from the scheduling. Now, there are other things that need to be done to minimize padding and make advertised travel times faster, but this one fix is easily one of the most significant. On top of that, upgrading to constant tension wires is one of the main parts of a proposed creation of a fourth section of 160 mph capable trackage on the route, which is planned to be the longest one to date, running from just outside Baltimore all the way to just past Newark, Delaware, thus only adding to the speed potential this upgrade holds long term. On top of that, Levy has estimated that this, along with track geometry upgrades and straightening of some curves, among several other factors, would be one of the keys to upgrading the ultimate top speed of the corridor from 160 to 186 miles an hour, the classic gold standard of high-speed rail, at least on certain parts of the route, most notably in New Jersey along the racetrack. If you thought trains went by Princeton Junction quickly now, that's going to be a whole different ballgame with those speeds.
But ultimately, it all comes down to funding and the urgency by those in positions of power to make this happen. And on top of that, the need for a cohesive vision for what the NEC is supposed to be, which we've honestly never gotten before. This summer really has shown just how difficult the situation has gotten, but at the very least, it's a bit reassuring that Amtrak, NJT, and the state government aren't just surrendering to the problem here. But as heat waves become more and more pronounced and common as the years go by, this situation will keep repeating itself until the wires are upgraded with these systems. So how much will this all cost, I hear a lot of you ask?
Well, it's been estimated that the current cost to bring the whole southern half of the corridor up to the specification would cost in the area of $3 billion just to do that. And on top of that is nearly $850 million more to bring the electrical systems in general up to a state of good repair. It may sound like a lot to some, but others are asking, what's the deal? It sounds pretty cheap actually. They're building the Frederick Douglass Tunnel for $6 billion, and the Gateway project in North Jersey is going to be around $16 billion. So why is there not a discussion about this nearly as much until recently? Well, as mentioned, it's definitely not a high-profile upgrade by comparison, and the projects they are underway, as good as they are pretty much the long-term equivalent of emergency repairs to replace infrastructure that's falling apart, and could even possibly stop the NEC from being functional if not addressed. And I think anybody with any sort of sense would say that a gimped Northeast Corridor is better than no Northeast Corridor. But beyond the projects that are underway right now, in my humble opinion, this is the update of the corridor that must take top priority. Not only for the constant tension setup and the improvements to speed and reliability that it entails, but also the deferred maintenance on a lot of electrical infrastructure in general. Which, while Amtrak has tried with what they have for the longest time, there is a lot more that needs to be fixed. Now, I am not an electrical engineer, and I definitely can't explain what those problems and solutions may be, at least without firmly Dunning-Krugering myself, but considering that the electrical infrastructure of this part of the line runs at a 25 Hz frequency as opposed to the National Power Grid standard of 60 Hz, since it dates back to before that standard was even set in the first place, which, despite what has been suggested by Wendover, it's not at all required to bring the frequency up to 60 Hz to make the line perform better. But regardless of that needless idea, there's still likely to be a fair bit more to do to bring the electrical systems up to a modern standard, hence the over $800 million backlog on the electrical system more generally. So, is there anything that can provide for this upgrade? Well, there's thankfully more hope than some might think. In the 2021 infrastructure law, of the money that went to projects on the NEC, $6 billion was set aside for state of good repair projects to fix long-standing issues with the line that don't involve building fancy new pieces of infrastructure like bridges and tunnels. And one of them that is being heavily suggested is that this money should go, at least in part, to upgrading the electrical systems and particularly the wires to constant tension. And in recent weeks, both state and federal figures representing New Jersey have been heavily pushing the Department of Transportation to allocate funding on top of that specifically for this problem. It seems that with the options on the table, politicians, railroad officials, and the public alike realize that it's about time to nip a long-standing issue with the most important rail line on the continent in the bud. It's extremely rare to have a true silver bullet solution to a long-standing and critical issue, but we may just have one with the upgrade of the line's wires to constant tension, and it could be that those who control the purse strings know it too. And nowhere do I think really shows that more than with one of those marquee projects of rebuilding the NEC's infrastructure. Flowing through the meadowlands of northern New Jersey is the Hackensack River, a 55-mile-long river that flows from Rockland County, New York, down to its mouth at Newark Bay. As the river flows between the New York suburbs of Secaucus and Kearney, the river and the boats and barges that ply their trade upon it encounter the Northeast Corridor on one of the route's worst pieces of infrastructure, the Portal Bridge. The Portal Bridge is one of the oldest bridges on the line, being completed when the part of the line between Newark and New York Penn Station, the first part of the southern half of the NEC to be electrified, was completed in 1910.
The Portal Bridge is one of the worst choke points on the Northeast Corridor, and I'd argue it's one of the worst bottlenecks of any transportation link in the whole country for multiple reasons. For one, the bridge is double-tracked only, it has a speed limit of 60 miles an hour, and maybe worst of all is the fact that the bridge is a swing bridge, which means that when a ship approaches it, the bridge has to physically swing out of the way, stopping rail traffic because boats cannot physically fit underneath it. Now, that's already bad enough, and it causes so many issues to begin with. But what's worse is that given the fact that the bridge is 115 years old, it should be no surprise that the bridge gets stuck open quite often, leading to a lot more backups. And this happens disturbingly often. So for the longest time, it's no surprise that the Portal Bridge was on the docket for a replacement. And that, thankfully, is happening right now.
The new bridge that will replace it, the Portal North Bridge, which is part of the much broader Gateway project, which is a revamp of the at-capacity tracks of the corridor between Newark and Manhattan, is going to be a big step forward for the route's reliability. Built much taller than the original bridge, this bridge will never have to move out of the way of boats, thus alleviating the most obvious problem with the current one. While the bridge is designed to be double-tracked, the speeds going over the bridge will be increased from 60 to 90 miles an hour, thus allowing faster travel times and higher capacity on this crucial segment of the line. But one of the things that doesn't get discussed as much in the midst of all this good stuff regarding the project is the wiring that'll be running over the bridge. While the poles do share the same timeless profile and configuration of the original Pennsy poles, this bridge will have constant tension catenary built in from day one, thus meaning that one of the most important pieces of transportation infrastructure on the continent will be future-proofed even further with this crucial upgrade. This is holding true for other infrastructure projects that are being built, most famously the 160-mile-an-hour capable replacement of the current Susquehanna River Bridge, but this will be the first one to see the light of day. As of June this year, the Portal North Bridge is halfway complete and is set to open on time in 2027 and on budget, which is fantastic to see for such an important project for the future of high-speed rail on the busiest corridor on the continent. Things can get better, and they will get better, but sometimes it takes some dogged determination to do so, even for something so simple yet so important. Because at the end of the day, it's all worth it for all of us. Even in the day-to-day it may go unnoticed for most of us, it's still important. The Northeast Corridor is still unequivocally the best rail line for passenger service, not just in the United States, not merely in all of North America, but in the Americas. It has no equal in terms of passenger usage, the number of trains that use it per day, and especially the speeds that those trains can achieve. It's America's current temple of speed upon the high iron, but it's also a line that can be agonizing to really think about. Not merely because the line is seen as not matching the standards of similarly vital high-speed corridors in Europe and Asia, but because it can be up there with the standard bearers from around the world, and perhaps become a model for other high-speed intercity rail projects across the continent can take inspiration from. And all of this without starting from scratch with a brand new high-speed corridor for the whole route, when the line is more than capable of being upgraded to those speeds. It may be a legacy line that has roots dating back nearly 2 centuries, but it's amazing to think that, regardless of its age, it has the potential to match the best in the world in an age where trains traveling at more than 3 miles a minute is the norm. That can happen here, and most importantly, the line and its surrounding networks can be dependable and fast as well. And while a lot of attention is given to monumental projects to create new and imposing structures that will be the public face of the route, there are a lot of other projects that need to be undertaken to truly make the line's performance match its image. and easily the most important is installing constant tension wires to make the heat waves of years down the line a non-issue for reliability, while also providing a bedrock for those faster speeds to be built off of. With trains becoming more popular as a transportation option than they have since the creation of Amtrak in the 70s, and as people begin to realize more and more the need for different options of travel rather than just the car, and the continual traffic jams and negative externalities that they entail, even with electric and hydrogen cars, along with people in the US looking more and more at countries around the world with modern rail systems and wondering why can't that be us, they will realize that a world-class intercity rail system that provides incredibly fast, frequent, and reliable trains connecting small town and big city alike is more attainable than we think. It's something that some of us had tacitly realized it's had the potential for a long time, but the age and lack of attention of the network has been the biggest reason why that hasn't been so. But now, we could be about to see the true beginning of the creation of just such a thing, and a seemingly unnoticed upgrade like constant tension catenary, among many other smaller things interspersed with the big flashy projects, will be the key to unlocking the true potential that this line has, making America's best rail line truly a marvel for the country and the world, but only if it is made known and we prepare for it. If we do, it would signal to the rest of the Northeast that this is truly the best way to get between the cities of the Northeast megalopolis, and become a sign that sometimes the smaller things can be pivotal in taking a massive leap forward in the speed, efficiency, and reliability of how we get around.